Good morning and afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's panel discussion. We are incredibly excited to explore a really important and timely topic, diversity, equity, inclusion, from a unique angle, the IT perspective. With IT innovation comes opportunity, and this is proving true for the transformations that you'll hear about today that help progress DEI initiatives on and off campus. We are thrilled to have two leading CIOs who are passionate about this topic. They will share their challenges and solutions and discuss the impact they have had on the diversity and inclusion at their campuses. Before we get started, just a couple of quick administrative items. This webinar will be recorded and made available for future viewing. Also, we are welcoming your questions throughout the webinar, so please post those in the chat box and I'll be monitoring those. And when there's an opportunity for a break in the discussion, we'll turn it over to some Q&A. And without further delay, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Orlando Leon is the former CIO at California State University at Fresno. Orlando was there starting in 2015. Before that, he was Director of Operations in the Office of the Provost for Teaching and Learning at Stanford University. Before that, he held positions at UC San Francisco. And early in his career, he held roles at Hewlett-Packard and Oracle. Thank you for joining us, Orlando.
Good morning.
Good morning. Next, we have Dr. Damian Clark, who is the Chief Information Officer and Computer Science faculty at the Alabama Agriculture and Mechanical University, AAMU. Before becoming CIO at AAMU, Damian was the CIO and computer science faculty at South Carolina State University. And before that, he has experience in DevOps at the financial giant Aon. Thank you for joining us today, Damian.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone.
And last but not least, we have Anthony Owada, who is the CEO of Apporto Corporation. Anthony is the founder and CEO of Apporto, a leader in cloud virtual desktops designed for higher education. He is a seasoned entrepreneur with a vibrant career in sales and marketing at Oracle and IntelliCorp. He has a master's degree in computer science from MIT. Welcome, Anthony.
Thank you, Heather.
Okay. Our agenda for today will cover the following topics. We will start with Anthony describing the state of computer labs today. And then we'll turn it over to our panelists to discuss the challenges with traditional computer labs, current initiatives they're focused on, and their visions for the future. A couple of specific topics we'll discuss include online classes, collaboration, and active learning. And we'll provide a demo so you can see how some of this works in practice. And we welcome Q&A throughout, and we'll also save time at the end for additional Q&A. And with no further ado, I will turn it over to Anthony Owada, CEO of Apporto, to start us off with the state of computer labs and the drivers for transformation.
Thank you. Thank you, Heather. And actually, you know, since obviously our speakers are here to talk about DEI, I would like to kick it off by asking them, you know, everybody has their own definition of DEI. In fact, it reminds me of the old joke of, you know, here's my definition of DEI, what is yours? But Orlando and Damian have been working on DEI matters for a good number of years. So the first question to you, Orlando, is what is DEI to you? What does it represent to you?
Thank you, Anthony. This is a great topic because I think when I asked myself and I reflected on this topic over the past several months, I think back of when I was a kid growing up in the city of San Francisco and just looking at it in almost terms of just two colors or two sides. It really was race, ethnicity maybe, and maybe gender at times. But those issues in the world and in society weren't as apparent, at least not to me. When I arrived at Fresno State 5-6 years ago, it really opened my eyes to see diversity in many other kind of angles and facets. What's interesting is Fresno State defines diversity. There's a broader definition, but it includes aspects of race, ethnicity, gender identity, socioeconomic status, culture, ability status, political aspects, religious aspects, and other aspects such as that. And so I really appreciated that because, for example, when I was a kid, I used to go to a church that was all Asian, and not realizing that even within that, you could say homogenous type of population, there were many distinct and diverse cultural subcultures and other aspects inside even the one ethnic kind of circle or makeup. So as I continued to journey through high school and college, my eyes were opened, and then especially when at my previous role at Fresno State, I really started to understand diversity in a much larger light. And so that's what it means to me in terms of the world and professionally, helping people to be able to understand, be aware, and then be able to, what I'll call bridge, to have conversations, which then better us in the way that we interact with the world and support the world through whatever job or role that we have. Personally, it also touches on an aspect of social justice. Perhaps that's the most important aspect of understanding. Again, in the past, I used to hear the term that in San Francisco, we are in a melting pot. But I've come to realize we're not here to assimilate each other. We're not here to make everyone the same. And so the analogy that more people started to use was something like a salad bowl, where you have different types of parts, different colors, different ingredients, and they don't necessarily blend or mix, but they work together for the greater good of things, for the greater good of the salad. So the social justice aspect's really important to me personally, and it touches on aspects of being empathetic and compassionate with those around me. And with the ultimate goal, this is something I usually try to say in the roles that I'm in. My role, what I try to do as CIO, as a human being as well, is to help people around me to flourish. And that's what diversity, equity, inclusion really means to me, to help people to flourish.
Great. Thank you, Orlando. We appreciate your perspective. And Dr. Clark, you're the CIO at a historically Black university. Sorry. Sorry about that. And obviously, with everything that's happened in the last year or two, you have probably had a unique perspective on this topic. So obviously, we're very interested in hearing your perspective.
All right, thank you. I wouldn't necessarily say it's unique, but I'll definitely give...
how about a different perspective than Orlando's?
So I think, DEI in general, for many of us, means the same thing. And for me, it means removing any history of injustice that has marginalized any group. It means creating and maintaining a successful social and professional community founded on the principle that everyone can thrive personally and professionally. It means identifying and respecting the presence of differences and ensuring that processes and programs are impartial, fair, and provide equal possible outcomes for every individual, while ensuring that people feel a sense of belonging. So when we look at an HBCU, and I could go into the demographics of Alabama A&M later, we see that an HBCU, like other MSIs, were not necessarily created with DEI in mind. However, when we look at the mission of HBCUs, it's DEI oriented. Historically for African Americans because of the situation of the times. But HBCUs don't have a tradition of discriminating against any group. As a CIO of an HBCU, my DEI focus is really to provide access to online resources, not just by providing a device, but figuring out a way to broadly provide access, even at home, for individuals who may live in rural communities and for individuals who live in urban communities that cannot afford cannot afford broadband access at home. So why does diversity matters? It matters because different perspectives directly influence processes and innovation. Why does equity matter? Because inequity means that there are barriers that give rise to disadvantages, ultimately leading to an inequitable process. And why does inclusion matter? Because inclusion maintains diversity.
Great, thank you very much. And you know, this reminds me of actually, honestly, it was only about 6 months ago that I realized that there was a difference in the word equality versus equity. I mean, I had heard the word equity before. And to me, equity was like, you know, stock in a company or something. But obviously, I think in the last 6 months, the difference between the word equality and the word equity really has come to the forefront. Orlando, perhaps help us understand, you know, what is your perspective on why did we talk about equality perhaps 10, 15 years ago, and why are we focused right now on equity?
It's a great question. And I think we're all going to be challenged to really define it as clearly as we would want. And maybe that's why, it's a guess, why equity was used earlier on, because it's just easier to think of something as 50-50. So if we were to say, how many computer scientists do we need who are female in the job industry? Well, if we use equity purely as it is, we would say, well, 50% makes a lot of sense, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's what we actually want or need. I don't think we want a world that's 50-50, because in some cases, I don't think it works. And I'll be brutally honest, equity might be hard to achieve in some cases, and it might not make sense in others. So equality, as we think about it, I think of this picture that I saw a couple of years ago. You may have seen a variation. Some people are at a baseball game and they're trying to look through a fence at that time, and they're trying to define, well, what does equity mean and equality? So equity means to give everyone the same things, and it could be a box to stand on to look over the fence. But if someone's shorter, then that same box won't be as effective. So you've seen variations where they say, okay, take down the fence or put a window in the fence, all these different aspects. So equality means that we find ways that in some cases might mean someone gets a stronger support system or gets additional aspects to help that person get an equitable experience. And so practically, what does that mean? It depends on the situation. And that's why it's so hard to define today. And it could get really slippery really quickly how we define it. So let me just pause there, because I think there is a reason why we do certain things, and I'll be brutally honest and transparent, because the topic of diversity is so broad. It's so hard to advocate for everything personally. So I will have to pick and choose my battles, so to speak, what I will advocate for more. And it will depend on what role I'm in. It will depend on where I'm at, how much energy I have, and whatever else is going on around me. So equity is hard, because we will, in some ways, we'll never get there. And I think that's okay, but we should always strive to get better. And in technology, we talk about continuous improvement of things and services and operations. And I think that's the world that we want to go as well, that we need to move toward and keep increasing our efforts in some ways so that we see progress as opposed to perfection.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, this makes a lot of sense. And, Dr. Clark, I think you rightfully mentioned that, diversity obviously has many components, but I can only imagine that equity in a historically Black college is very much, a current item. I mean, I can only imagine that at any university that are students who are better off than others, maybe financially, or maybe from their location, or maybe their parents were, trained in a university versus other students. So what does what does the concept of equity represent to you?
So, um, so I think the equality, and forgive me if I'm backwards with that. I think the equality means sameness. Equity is tied to more justice, right? It has a legal connection with it. So if you look at this from an HBCU perspective, so I was a CIO at South Carolina State University. Now I'm a CIO of Alabama A&M. Both of these institutions are state institutions. So if you look at this from the perspective of history, Clemson University was created because South Carolina State University was going to be created. If I say Clemson University to anyone, I think somebody has some connection with Clemson University. If you go visit Clemson University, it is as big as the town Clemson. So Clemson University and South Carolina State Clemson University may be 3 or 4 years older than South Carolina State University. And Clemson University, the resources that was poured into Clemson University is, far outmatch any of the resources that was poured into South Carolina State University. Here in Alabama, the story is similar between Alabama A&M and Auburn University. So in terms of equity, resources weren't given to these institutions in an equitable way, right? Meaning that not that South Carolina, CSU, Alabama A&M deserve or should have gotten the same equal funding, but given the situation and given the type of students that we service, the funding wasn't equitable. It was inequitable. It was unjust. It was not justified. So given that there's a history, these institutions have a historical, at least at the state level, it has been historically underfunded. And because of that, the resources we have on these campuses is not comparable to an Auburn or a Clemson. So it's difficult when we graduate students that these students could match or be competitive to these organizations who, were given most of the resources to do the things that they needed to do.
Great, thank you. Thank you for a great answer. And this brings us to the role of the CIO, to the role of IT. And of course, since, Apporto sells, virtual computer labs, virtual desktops, this is where we're gonna end up. But tell us a little bit, and if I may start by asking Orlando, tell us a little bit about your perspective. What is the role of the CIO? And what is the role of the cabinet? What have you seen at CSU Fresno to try to deal with all these matters?
So let me clarify, Anthony. We're not getting into the technology aspects yet, but just with diversity, equity, and inclusion.
No, this is really at the crossing of IT and DEI. So we're not talking about computer labs quite yet. We're going to talk about computer labs next. But for now, in your role as the top IT person at CSU Fresno, how did you view, your role as the top IT person to help with those DEI? I mean, there are things you couldn't help with. For instance, in terms of admissions, it was not your responsibility to deal with, DEI issues when it comes to admissions, right? That fell outside of your responsibility. But
Well,
go ahead.
so yeah, thank you for clarifying. I think that is really important. So the first thing I'll say is that over the past several years, it's become more apparent in many institutions that the CIO is a person who's very integral in the university as a whole. That perhaps at some places the CIO is still seen as perhaps the technology leader, but in many cases, and especially through COVID-19 and the pandemic that we're still going through, that the CIO is really a university leader that perhaps focuses on technology issues first and foremost, but really tries to have that grander vision and understanding of the university as a whole. So as I was able to serve as vice president and being on the cabinet, of course, my first priority was always going to be to make sure that technology was taken care of and that we were strategizing correctly and anticipating correctly. But as it comes to matters of diversity, equity, and inclusion, there were many times where the president and the cabinet, we had very great dialogue about how do we support this aspect, this large, broad category of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging for employees, for students, and for the community. And a lot of times it wasn't about how can we use technology, but how do we look through things. And so when you bring up the admissions example, I would actually say in some cases, I was asked to make sure I think about everything holistically. So it was about working with my admissions colleagues or faculty colleagues or financial aid colleagues and other colleagues to really think through all the systemic types of issues and challenges that might come through existing processes. That while there may be a need to change something, it may include a technology solution, it may not. And so I think holistically, there's always a possibility that technology can be part of it. But I believe, and we'll get more of this as we move through the future years, that the CIO will continue to become looked at more and more as a university leader that really needs to think through all of these different challenges, not just technology on its own.
Great, thank you. And Dr. Clark, from your perspective, where do you see kind of the intersection between IT and DEI? I mean, obviously DEI is a, paramount goal that transcends every aspect of a university. But specifically in IT, how did you look at it? Did you look at it from the perspective of your staff, ensuring diversity and equity within your staff? Did you look at it from the perspective of ensuring that through the systems that you deployed, you made sure that the students had, equal access, equal capabilities, etc., or perhaps both?
Yes, all of the above. I think to build a diverse and equitable and inclusive organization, you got to look at it holistically. You can't, if you could change or influence a specific department, great, but really and truly it has to be looked at holistically. You got to look at the root causes for your specific organization, understand where to focus, the biggest impact, where can the targeted interventions take place? You need to identify the actions and set priorities for the root causes. You need inclusive leaders, not just the CIO or the cabinet, but even at the entry-level organization, it's not just enough for the so-called leaders, cabinet members, or CIOs to be inclusive leaders. It has to be at all levels within the organization. And by being an inclusive leader, people need to look at their own thoughts, their perceptions, their actions. Is it inclusive? Are there unconscious biasness, right? So you need to look at behavioral inclusion, right? So some individuals may have to go on a journey of self-discovery. I worked at an organization, that you mentioned before. The building had almost 1,000 people. and we had about 10 minority from the African American side. And the organization said, well, let's have some DI training. And everybody got into an uproar and said, why? We are already diverse. All right, we don't need to go through DI training. And specifically with technology, you need to look at structural inclusion. All right, we may have a talent system that is not optimized for human performance. It may have inherent or built-in biasness. We may have an AI system that may have built-in biasness. So from the technology perspective, we have to look, is the technology biased, right? And, from, serving a population that is, almost 80% on Pell Grants, I have to find ways of providing access. And access, like I said earlier, it's not just about giving a device. Like for the pandemic, we quickly learned, we can't just give a laptop to individuals. They don't have internet access at home. So we bought laptops with that could accommodate a SIM card. So we were able to activate broadband, on these laptops. So the household, not just the student or the faculty or the staff, could get internet access and do the things that they wouldn't ordinarily be able to do.
Very, very cool. And Orlando, this reminds me of, a number of projects that you've undertaken at CSU Fresno. So perhaps if you can share with us, some of those projects.
Absolutely. And I'm actually going to layer on top of what Damian says, because I think that's such an important point, but I want to add another flavor to it. So my wife is a pharmacist, so she's in healthcare and she's actively working with patients, and usually with patients with a higher risk for heart attack and stroke. But as that connects with COVID-19, a lot of it dealt with, well, if you are a patient who is at high risk for COVID-19 complications, then those patient populations would also be those that she works with. One of her projects that she's really working on is related to the DEI aspects, and it's a fairly newer kind of a concept called social determinants of health. And I would relate that to what we're talking about here. So Damian used the word biases, and there are definitely clear biases. And as we think about the ethics of AI and the ethics of how we program into systems, sometimes it's not a bias, but sometimes it's just a diversity matter, an equity matter. It can be a bias, but it can also be an assumption that we make because, for example, we've grown up in the United States. And I look around and actually maybe you haven't grown up in the United States. So I think you know what I'm talking about. So for example, when we were rolling out vaccines, we made an assumption, well, let's make things equitably available, meaning that, or equally available, meaning that we have sites that give vaccines to anyone who asks, and all they need to do is show their ID, or all they need to do is go online and fill out a form. Well, there's not necessarily a bias there, although that you can argue that, but you can say there's an assumption there that people have online access. And to Damian's point, maybe they don't, which is why hotspots were provided. Or maybe they don't speak English, so when you put your website out there, they don't know what they're reading. And so they're more hesitant, or maybe they're more afraid of what it's saying. So are we thinking about the social determinants of, let's say, student success, or the social determinants of fill in the blank? When we ask a question and we write a program, when we write a line of code, are we thinking about the social determinants of who's using the system? And so as we think about technology and the solutions that we're building out, I do think we need to broaden that perspective, that so often we bring in our current experiences, what we learned in school, which you could say is also a certain bent of a lesson in history, or a certain bent of a theory and such, that may or may not be equally applicable across the entire world. So I think as we look at these things and we think about technology solutions, we need to think about that. So at Fresno State, pre-pandemic, we already were giving out iPads out to students as loaners, because we wanted to figure out how we can provide a more, I guess, equal experience in the classroom. If someone didn't have a computing device, while we couldn't afford laptops or computers, necessarily the regular full-on computers, we said, let's see what we can do. And so that was the iPad. And so as the pandemic rolled on, we said, we learned and we heard from students, and this is the big part. We need to talk with those out there, not just the one subgroup, but as many as possible. And we learned that internet access was a challenge. And so hotspots was one of the biggest things. And at that time, during the pandemic, Fresno State, I believe, gave out something like several thousand hotspots we lent out and provided the data. And we might have been one of the biggest universities in terms of the number of hotspots that we gave out during 2020. And it's because our students really needed it. And this year, as we continued through the fall 2021, the Cal State system embarked on a new program to provide basic computing devices through a program called C-Success. And that's where several campuses so far have opted in to provide any incoming freshman or transfer student with an iPad if they just say, I have a need for one. And we won't verify, because when we do verify things, that also throws in kind of a bias or assumption into the system where perhaps we are asking the wrong question, or perhaps that provides an unequal playing field for certain people who may not be able to show an ID card or proof of citizenship or proof of financial aid or something else that we just don't understand. So this is why equality and equity can get really fuzzy really quickly. But what we're trying to do is go for the 80% case in many cases. And so that's just a few of the things that we're doing. And the Apporto and the virtual computing labs is another layer of service that we think that our students really, really need at Fresno State.
Thank you so much. That was very insightful. And Damian, so obviously you had been looking, and you had some form of virtual computer lab before COVID, and you had a virtual computer lab during COVID, and now you have Apporto. Tell us, what were the drivers from your perspective for virtual computer labs? How did that evolve over time? And what is your perspective on that moving forward?
Well, strangely enough, it started as a climate change perspective. Being the CIO at South Carolina State University, in fact, being a student at South Carolina State University and eventually transitioning to the CIO, I spent quite a few years on this campus. And I remember as an international student from the Caribbean, landing in Orangeburg, South Carolina, the first question I asked was, does it snow here? And, and the answer was, no, once in every 5 years. And I did 2 degrees at South Carolina, so I spent 4.5 years. And I think it actually snowed very likely once during that period. Having transitioned to a faculty and a CIO, it snows or ice almost every year. On top of that, with the hurricanes, even if we don't get hit directly with a hurricane, the thunderstorms would knock us out. Power, I kid you not, our data center would leak, so I would have to put a plastic covering over the equipment in our data center. Coming to Alabama A&M, the first question I asked was, well, do you guys get hurricanes here? He said, no, not really, but we get tornadoes. I said, okay. So apparently, being in northern Alabama, we in what is called the Tornado Alley. So I said to my team, should a tornado hit Alabama A&M smack on, from an IT perspective, we shouldn't blink. So every improvement, every upgrade, we have to think from that mentality. So I think I started here in July of 2018. The pandemic, late 2019, 2020. Everything we did from the perspective of being able to survive a tornado. Lo and behold, an invisible tornado hits called COVID. So from a networking perspective, from a data center perspective, from a computer lab perspective, we wanted to be able to transition, should we have to, anywhere, anytime access. So from that perspective, we were looking at a virtual computer lab. So we first looked at it from the perspective, we actually first looked at Apporto. Then we said, not really. Then we looked at it from the perspective of, let's just virtualize the applications, put it in a single sign-on, and people could access it from a browser on any internet-ready device. That didn't go too well. And then we decided, well, we need a portal, we need the robustness of a portal, and hence we moved to a portal. But the idea of an anytime, anywhere access, whether it's from the enterprise side computing, the research side computing, or just an average computer lab classroom, we looked at it first from this is a climate change issue, and we want to be ready from that perspective. And we wanted our facilities to be accessible to anyone, faculty, student, and staff, beyond the brick and mortar classroom.
Great, great. Thank you very much. Orlando, unlike Damian, you've been using Apporto, you've been using virtual computer labs for 2-3 years now. So you've had more time, more data, more feedback. What essence of that feedback or data can you share with us that would be relevant to the audience?
Yeah, so Damian's case of the not necessarily disaster recovery, but just the flexibility, the accommodation to be able to still do work in any situation is really important for Fresno State as well. That was one big thing. But maybe I'll highlight one piece of feedback that came in the form of a letter that went to one of our managers and then to the president as well. And it was a letter from a student who essentially, you can read her emotions through the letter. She was very thankful. Two main things: that she had a device, but also she had written, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, but that for one of those years of her schooling, she had to come in every night to the library to go to a computer lab because she had no access, not the right tool sets either, from her home. And it could have been a combination of access, device, tool set, internet. It might have been all of the above, an environment that was or conducive to learning. And so she had come in every night and stayed to midnight every single day that the library was open and that there was a lab computer. And this person was so thankful that, first of all, we had the discovery program to provide a device, but also subsequently then now providing these things like the Apporto solution that allows for someone not to necessarily have to, and our students might commute for, it could be 15 minutes, 30 minutes, but sometimes over an hour each way to school. And so the safety aspect of coming into campus or leaving campus at night or in the early morning hours. So the Apporto solution was really meant for a lot of different aspects. One, physical labs that were open or not. Certain schools and colleges had different abilities or capabilities, or even types of computers that were, some were getting older, or the physical space, or sometimes the computer labs were booked for labs and people couldn't use them during certain times. Some of them closed at 5, some of them closed at later hours, some of them closed at midnight. So being able to provide an environment that was always available and essentially easy to access, these were some really, really important factors of why we chose to go with a virtual computing lab solution, and then also why we're choosing to continue with it for as long as we can afford it. I can go into many, many other aspects, but that hopefully that one story from that student helps our audience to understand one of the big reasons why we're doing this.
It was such a great story. I think we're going to have it on our website as early as tomorrow morning, Orlando. Thank you. So Damian, looking a little bit further into the future, I mean, there are many perspectives on the future of computer labs. I think I was talking to a CIO and who used the words that, traditional computer labs remind him a little bit of like cemetery rows. I think the word that he described, with the headstones being the desktops next to each other. Sometimes there are a lot of students, sometimes they're empty. What is your view on the future of computer labs? How will the physical computer labs change over time? How will virtual computer labs change over time? how will those work together or not work together? What's your perspective?
So in the 3 years I've been here, I've had to implement a lot of different technologies, upgrade the infrastructure. We started at 1 gigabyte bandwidth for the campus, 6,000 students, 1,200 faculty and staff. Luckily now we got, 3 redundant 10 gig connections. So I've done a lot of implementation. In fact, people have known me for just changing things. And as we all know, that, change is not good or bad change. People don't, necessarily like changing because they got to learn something new. But I will say that, when I implemented Apporto, that was one of the changes that faculty, a lot of faculty, especially STEM faculty, ran towards. Because for 2 main reasons. One, the idea of a physical computer lab that for whatever reason needs maintenance every semester or is not ready for instruction at the time that faculty needs it. That is a pain point for a lot of faculty. So to be able to just open a browser, click on Apporto Security Lab or whatever VM we have out there, and students could access it anywhere. Faculty was really, really appreciative of that. And we actually want to expand our Apporto footprint on this campus. Moving from an existing physical lab to a virtual lab or some hybrid requires some cost, right? What I would say about the Apporto solution, it's almost like an easy button. Once it's implemented, it runs. You don't need anybody to babysit it. So from an IT perspective, it's great. And from the end user, functional user perspective, it's great. The other thing that before I forget, that they really like about Apporto, and I hate to use the application that we're using now, even though Zoom is a collaboration platform, along with the virtual environment, there's some built-in collaboration that the faculty really like with Apporto. So some people can't move virtually because they don't have the resources to move virtually. Some situations cannot move virtually. So if you have a research lab, research in instrumentation, you still need that in-person, that person to go hands-on and deal with those instruments. So in some cases, it will be difficult and almost impossible to do it virtually. But the traditional cemetery type computer labs, I think if it can be afforded for the institution, I think the institution needs to quickly move away from that type of scenario. Just the maintenance of those labs. The space, to me, could be used for more innovative type of situations. For example, I am actually removing one of the labs here, those cemetery type labs here at Alabama A&M. And I'm implementing what is called a Fab Lab. This is something that came out of MIT. It's a place to go create and be innovative. And I'm going to put other types of equipment in there so that students could do, 3D scanning and build and create stuff, rather than to just have a space where people walk in and sit behind a computer to read, email or whatever. So I think it's something that we need to and should move away from. It'll be difficult for smaller institutions to do if it's already set up. But I think an anytime, anywhere access, as a CIO, I'm always thinking about how could I effectively and cost effectively do that, not just for the institution, but for my stakeholders, faculty, students, and staff.
Great. Thank you very much for the very insightful answer. Heather, we have a couple of questions here, if you want to convey them to our panel.
Absolutely. Thank you. I didn't want to interrupt, so this is perfect. I'm glad you gave me an inroad. So we have some great questions from Christopher. He's asking about metrics, because metrics obviously help you know if you're improving. And he's curious, how are you using metrics to monitor your DEI, pulse? And do you adjust your solutions to get closer to improving those metrics?
So I'll take a quick stab at that. So Alabama A&M is a state institution in the state of Alabama. The state of Alabama only legally recognizes race as diversity, equity, and inclusion. So from a legal perspective, that's really the only metric we could look at. The different races we have. Being a historically Black institution, we normally attract African Americans, even though we have all races. We have a whole lot of international students, international faculty and staff. From a metric perspective, as a CIO, I don't do it. I don't keep metrics. I think it's something that, as a state institution, I leave it up to HR to define the metrics and to determine whether or not we meet those metrics. So I take the lead from the HR department from that perspective.
Makes a lot of sense. Orlando?
Yeah, so this is a great question, but a very difficult one, because one, as we realize with any technology solution, let me step back. In order to really effectively understand whether something is successful, it takes time and it takes controlled experiments. So think of our vaccines and why they took so long and why the American public and politics played into such a great part is because people wanted the FDA to approve of the vaccines much more quickly. One side wanted the FDA to do that. So but you think of the same thing in the higher ed world or in any technology world. We could choose to say, if we roll out Apporto virtual labs or any other technology solution, let's just roll it out for 2% of the people for 2 years. Let's see how it goes. And then we look at that compared to a controlled subset of people where they don't get Apporto, very intentionally do not get it. And then let's measure the differences. Well, 2 years passes and then you discover another variable that has changed and you have to redo your experiment or your assessment. That's the quote unquote right way to do things. And it's not necessarily 2 years, but it could just vary depending on project and situation. But the point is, we don't do that in higher ed. When we roll something out, we say everyone gets the opportunity, because if we spent a lot of money and time to do it, why would we say that some people cannot use it while others can? I'll tie back any type of metrics back to a university's goals, whether that's on the DEI and belonging aspect, or maybe it's overall institutional goals. So at Fresno State, we are part of this GI 2025 graduation initiative that by 2025, we're going to raise graduation rates. And we are also going to close equity gaps. Similar to Damian, we are a state institution, the Cal State is, and we do have to be careful how we measure things and look at things. But generally speaking, when we talk about equity gaps, we're talking about race and gender. And so we look at that and we'd say, well, how is a certain population doing? And how's another one doing? All else equal. Now, is Apporto helping close that gap? Possibly. How do we measure that? That's the question of metrics. And I think it's a little fuzzy because we don't know if Apporto, for example, in this case, is helping close those gaps, or if it's something else that we're doing at the same time. And this is where the controlled experiments is really the most accurate way to measure, but we just are not able to do that. So I would encourage any of us who are working in technology, try to do a baseline of some sorts, and then try your best to measure things. A lot of the feedback of effectiveness, especially on the diversity, equity, inclusion, might be more anecdotal, where the student population or the faculty population, they might say, yes, this has been really great. I'll also throw out there, the data sometimes is flawed. If we look at some of the data we collect especially things that are relating to IPEDS, which is more the federal, state and federal kind of understanding of diversity in when it comes to ethnicity and at least identified ethnicity. They group Asians, for example, most of the time into one, or Hispanics. And I know we're starting to break that out. But Asians, for example, that's an interesting topic. At Fresno State, many of the East Asians and the South Asians are doing very well. But the Southeast Asians are not. Many of the women are doing well, and many of the men are not in the Asian category. So how do we make sure we also disaggregate everything correctly so that we really know what the data is trying to say? So I'm giving a long answer, but the point is there's a lot we can measure. And I think I would encourage each institution to look back at its university goals and what is it trying to solve. And usually there's a gap, and Damian's goals will be different than my goals.
Yeah.
Sorry,
go ahead, Heather.
Oh, if you have anything to add on, please do. There's another question. Go ahead.
Let's give audience some airtime, to be candid. I think I've had a lot of airtime here. Go ahead.
All righty. So this next question relates a bit to the prior one. Often budgets are easier to justify when you have hard data and metrics to prove that the money is being well spent. So how do you justify a budget request for something that is somewhat fuzzy, like DEI?
So, yeah, that's a good question.
That's a tough one, huh?
So my budget comes from two main places and a third small place. The biggest allocation is from the state, then the second allocation is at the federal level, and we may get some private funding. On the private side, it's easier to justify things. On the state side, we always have to be led by the state, their laws, their rules, their regulations, their policies. And we try to stay within the state's direction. And and I've had this conversation, with my CFO and, other entities at the cabinet level. This institution will not justify a budget spend if it goes remotely or close in the fuzzy area that would cause the state or anyone at the state level to say, hey, that's a spend that we will not tolerate, and somebody gets in trouble. So if it's in the fuzzy area, especially with DEI, we will not move forward, because we get, and I don't want to get political, but we get dinged on so many different things, that with our limited resources, we cannot take the chance. Let me put it that way. If the state says this is our policy, this is our procedure, we follow it to the letter. Every year, we go through an audit, and the auditor actually comes on campus and stays here for weeks and goes through everything and goes through every spend. So we have to be very, very, very careful. On the private funding side, if the entity says, well, you can do what you want with the money, or this is what I want you to do with the money, then we have a little more playroom to do different things.
Right. Orlando?
Okay, here's my stab at it. I'm going to tie this back to digital transformation and innovation. First, I would encourage each of us to use our intuition. Use your gut. Most of us who engage in these DEI topics do so for a few different reasons, and I'm generalizing very largely here. One, we've been personally affected by the topic, or two, we've known someone who's been personally affected. And then there's a big other category where we get guilt tripped into thinking about this, but hopefully that leads us to really understand this actually affects me too, right? So that being said, if we are personally affected or we know someone personally affected, and I'm talking about DEI now being fuzzy, we have probably an intuition or an instinct that tells us something's not right, something's not equitable. The next question is, how do we dive into that intuition? Well, there are many ways we can do that. I would encourage us to look to our institutional research arms of the university, partner with them. Partner with faculty immensely. They are such a great resource, and many of them are already doing research into the topic of DEI and how it connects back to social justice, inequities. Technology is a big part of that. For example, one of our faculty members at Fresno State many years ago did a research study looking at those students with lower socioeconomic status and whether or not technology plays any statistically significant aspect of whether or not technology will benefit them. And in his initial study, he was able to verify that yes, technology is more impactful for those who do not have the technology. So working with that kind of data is a starting point. So you need to find someone, if you can't do it yourself, to do the research, to look into the study, and that takes time. So start early. There are many, many, many grants, especially in the Biden administration, that support broadband efforts and other social justice types of efforts. California has a lot as well. Look for grants and opportunities. And yes, those are one-time funds, but you'll need those one-time funds to prove that your instinct or intuition is right. And that, again, goes all the way back to digital transformation and innovation, where usually it starts with a bold person who's willing to take a courageous step to show that their hunch or their intuition is right. And so I encourage you, as leaders of higher education, take that step, take that bold step.
And Orlando, on this great finale, we have 3 minutes till the hour. So I just want to take the time to thank our audience. Thank you guys for joining, obviously, what is a timely yet difficult topic, I'm sure. I want to thank our panelists for providing tremendous insights. Orlando, Damian, you guys were terrific. Dealt obviously with something that's close to your heart, but also is a challenge to cover. And Heather, thank you very much for hosting this event. Thank you all, and we hope to see you again at an upcoming webinar. Thanks again.
Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you, everyone. And this concludes our webinar. Have a wonderful day.
Take care, Damian. Bye.
Take care. Nice meeting you.